Hello and welcome to the Common Creative Podcast. My name is Chris Meredith.
And my name is Paul Fairweather. And despite the fact of not having the Common Creative t-shirt on, Chris and I are on a mission under the Common Creative banner to lift the lid, open the door, take a peek at creativity, life and business through the lens of ideas, stories and visual communication. And today, Chris, you and I are going to have a chat. We don't have a guest lined up.
We're taking a bit of a risk, I think, in that we're going to chat to each other about a particular topic, and we don't have a firm plan for it. It's a bit of an improvisation. And the theme that we wanted to explore, which I think goes to the heart of what creativity is about, is indeed risk. So we're embodying the idea of risk in this recording today.
Yeah, Chris, I think it's interesting. Our last guest was Stacey Hall, a friend of yours from Canada, and she mentioned risk. And I don't recall in the 200 episodes plus that we've done whether we've really talked about risk. You know, I think there's other things that we talk about, fear, but specifically risk, I don't think we have. So, and when Stacey mentioned it, it really rang some bells for me, because my first thing was I would say that I am not a risk taker. However, when I think about it in a creative sense, I think I am. How about you?
I agree completely that I think I'm a risk taker. I think I would describe myself. I am a risk taker, and I enjoy the idea of risk. I mean, you know, my business is called Chili Sauce, which is about embodying this idea of something a bit dangerous, or something a bit spicy, something that kind of brings you alive. I think it's quite a deep idea, because if you're not taking risks, and making mistakes, you're not learning, you're not growing. So to me, risk runs to the very heart of creativity. And my suggestion is that anybody that's creating things, particularly artists, they're being very vulnerable, they're very open, they're kind of sharing ideas that haven't been seen by the world before, and therefore inviting judgment. And sometimes that judgment's positive, sometimes it's negative, but it's always a risk. It's safer not to do that stuff. It's safer to sit at home and read a book and not create art. So I think risk and creativity are closely married to each other.
Yeah, which is bizarre, given we've had 200 episodes and we haven't talked about it. So, but it makes me think, I go back to a few episodes back, 205, Karen Steenkamp, and she talked about, we spoke with her about the fact that she does these amazing charcoal drawings, which she's never shared. And you're encouraging her to share, and I was going, just share when you're ready. And it's interesting, when I remember when I started painting first time as an adult, as opposed to when I was painting at school, I was painted, and I had no intention of showing anyone. And I wonder, and I just explored, I wonder if there was any risk involved there, but if I paint now, even though if I'm saying, well, I may or may not show this to people, there is still, there's an element of risk, because I've got this thing of people's judgment. What will people think if I put it into the world? When I first started, and as Karen's in this situation, and there's sort of like, she's a virgin in terms of putting into the world. And so she has that naivety about not having that judgment. It's before we ate the apple. So it's, I think it's curious.
It's interesting, because I think it's very important, certainly for artists, not so much commercial creatives. I think Stacey, for example, in our last broadcast, she's running a successful business. So when you're creating something, it's vital you think, what will other people think? Because it's important that they come to your store and buy the stuff and make it a commercial success. But for artists, I think it's very important in a way to ignore what people think, because if you start double guessing, what will the world think of what I'm creating, you disappear into a kind of a storm of double guessing yourself, trying to work things out, and the core idea starts to go by the wayside. So I think when something is, let's say something is artistic, something is an expression very much of you in the raw, it's important to ignore what the world might think, hard as that may be, because I find it an essential part of the process, having created something, that you do share it and therefore invite feedback. But in creating it, ignore them.
I think there's two things, and I want to go back to the artist and not the commercial. So I want to come to something you just said there about the artist, not the commercial. But I was thinking about the commercial years ago when I was an architect. For a couple of years, I was also a property developer, and we did property, and I was the architect and the property developer. What I realized and I didn't understand is that I thought in designing for other people that I made decisions. So we would put together a proposal and we would put it forward, and we would sell that idea, and more often than not the client would run with it. And I felt, because we put that up and it went ahead, that we were making design decisions. It wasn't until I was on the other side of the fence and I had to go, well, here's an idea. We're going to spend all this money to bring it into the world. Will people buy these apartments based on this? That I realized that for 30 or 40 years, I never made a decision in reality in terms of design, because all I was doing was making recommendations, and there's no risk in making recommendations. There is a very slight risk that you might get fired, and I only got fired once in that 30-year career. And in fact, that was really someone working for me got fired, and then I got fired too.
We've all been there, Paul.
But it's interesting that basically, so I think that on a commercial sense, or even, and that's where it goes to the next part of it, is that when we're creating art, and if you're a full-time artist, you actually are commercial as well. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road or gets stuck on the road or stuck in a rut, because you want to do these things, but you know what sells. When I painted, and I was with a well-known gallery in Brisbane, Jan Murphy Gallery, and I'd started painting these things which I call Fat Man Dancing, which morphed into later to Everyman. And I sort of was painting them, and I got into a thing, and I really enjoyed them, and people loved them. And then I stopped and started painting other things, but everyone wanted my Fat Man. All of a sudden, I had this thing where I was like, wow, I'm now, sort of in demand for this. And I really sort of pushed back a bit against it, because, there was no risk if I did it. It wasn't the reason.
You found a formula which were, if I can, for listeners, I can explain, and forgive me, Paul, correct me if I get this wrong, but the sort of Fat Man series are kind of very graphic. They're kind of, the people look like kind of, sort of oval shapes, and they wear hats, these beautiful wide brimmed hats.
Actually, the reinvention, Chris, that I used to do before, it was a little bit more figurative. They didn't wear hats, but they didn't have faces either.
Yes.
So, and they were more blocky. And not bright colors. I've gone to now a thing which is inspired by some bottles, and their oval shape. They wear hats and they're bright colors. So, but it's interesting, but it's that thing about, what the audience wants, and producing that after you know what the audience wants is not risky.
So in a way, it's a handicap. If you find something that turns out to be popular, that other people appreciate, the obvious thing is to do more. And what I'm hearing from you, therefore, and that's in a way a step back, because it's very safe, and you can do more in that same theme, knowing that people will like them and enjoy them. But where's the challenge? Where's the creativity in doing more of that stuff? So is that fair, that if you find a successful formula, it becomes a blockage to new creativity?
Well, I think it's. I don't know the answer. What that reminds me of, and I think we spoke about this in the last interview we had with Stacey, but the story of Ken Doan.
Yes. And
as the story, I might have it wrong, and Ken, if you're listening, please correct me. In fact, we should get you on the show.
We should. Ken, so he lives down the road, and so that's a really good prop. Let's get him on the show.
So, the story I heard of Ken was he was a painter, and he had an art show and an exhibition, and he painted, he did some T-shirts, which he sent to journalists and stuff to get some publicity. And everyone wanted the T-shirts. I don't know how many paintings he sold, but they always wanted the T-shirts. And that was sort of the start of his morphing into this stuff that he did around tea towels and napkins and blankets and sheets and towels and all these sort of things. And as I understood it, what happened was he just painted. And he had a team of people that would take those work and deconstruct them and take elements and put them together and design them and make this other stuff, which became him very, very successful. It didn't impact him at all, because he just kept on painting what he always did and what he always wanted to do. However, the challenge came later, I think, when probably, his brand, as all things did, became less popular. It wasn't the huge hit it was in the 2000s. He basically then, I remember seeing an interview or reading an interview about him, was saying, well, people don't take me seriously as an artist now. So, and it's curious because he didn't do anything different. His work was commercialized. I suppose a lot of prints out there, a lot of copies of his work. But as far as he was considering, he was just doing the same thing that he's always said. but the audience had a different view now.
There's an interesting, my sort of evolution of my understanding of Ken Doan's work is, I kind of, many years ago, I had a doona with a Ken Doan design on it in the UK, and a beautiful, brightly coloured thing. And you can see why his work would be so commercially successful. It's happy work. It's bright colours. It celebrates the very best of Australia. Over time, you start to understand that it's very commercial, his work. Whether it's deliberately commercial is a separate question, which we might ask him. But he was challenged a few years back to do a series of works that commemorate the Japanese submarine attack on Sydney Harbour. A very poignant subject. I think there was an anniversary coming up, and it was an attack which was both successful in that the Japanese managed to sink some ships in Sydney Harbour, but unsuccessful in that none of the submariners survived that attack. They all died in various ways. So a very poignant thing to cover. And I was struck that Ken Doan was invited to create some works for that, and they're brilliant. I adore them. They're powerful, they're moving, they are highly appropriate. They capture, I think, the horror, the fear that people must experience in those situations. My impression of Ken Doan as an artist changed dramatically at that point. And suddenly thought, there is a person that can communicate different ideas. It's not just a happy sunshine. In this instance, a very different story. And I thought, wow, that's real skill to be able to switch between those two kinds of ideas. So yeah, we definitely need to get him on the show to hear more about that.
But it's interesting in having said that, I think he's a brilliant painter. And when I look at his work in the view of a painting, you can see the enormous amount of energy that he puts into it. You don't get the same sense of it when it's elements of that are put onto a tea towel.
No.
That becomes designed, and it's a pattern and stuff. So I think it is really quite interesting. For me, I said before, I've never really considered myself a risk taker, as such as, I don't bet big. I wouldn't put the house on an idea. Yet after speaking with Stacey, when she was defining it in the way that she should have talked about it, I went, well, yeah, I take risks every day. I'm putting stuff out into the world. And what do I risk? I suppose if I'm putting it into a show, I risk they won't sell. So it's commercial failure. I suppose I risk that people don't like it. So there's some rejection there. And I think that's probably a big driver for a lot of people. This whole thing about I'm not good enough. And I suppose, very deep seated, probably down there somewhere, I risk, being ridiculed. Mm-hmm. But, that's probably not frame of mind. It's more about being rejected, I think, or not appreciated or ignored. Probably, we risk being ignored when we put
that. I say that to people when I'm having an exhibition. I say, I really don't mind if you love my work or you hate my work, but please don't say it's okay. That's the very, very worst feedback you can give an artist. I think it's fine. To be ignored. I think what the reward for the risk taking is that the world think, I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but artists are bearing a bit of their salt. They're sharing something inside themselves. And I think a lot of people admire and respect that here's somebody brave enough to open up and say, this is what I see out there. And I think it's why a lot of people appreciate art is it's somebody's delivered something which may be deeply personal, maybe something that they themselves can't express clearly. And other people really respect and admire that. The trouble is the very fact that it's personal and a bit raw makes it very hard when you get those comments like, I don't like it, it's not very good, or I know a really good artist by that, and you get some story about something else, and that that's the pain that comes with the risk. And I think the other side of it all is simply that if you don't go there, it's like Stacey was saying, when the advantage of risk is the kind of the pain of the journey makes the reward that much higher. I think that's exactly the same with art, that the kind of the risk you take in sharing ideas makes the reward that much stronger. And I know when people buy my work, I often say to them, are you sure? This work wasn't created for you. It's created for me, actually. And if you want it, that's great. But it's in a way it surprises me that other people want to enjoy my work as well.
I sort of just where you're thinking there, Chris, about the artists, and there's two things. I want to sort of go back a few sort of ideas about what we produce and put into the world, and whether it's something to a formula or not. But my favorite quote of recent times has been from Nick Willing, who I've tried to get on the show. We tried to get on the show, or Katie Hessel, who wrote the book that he's in called How to Live a Creative Life. He said that the artist, or his mother said the artist is a person who goes to a place that we've never been and brings back something we've never seen, but you instantly recognize. And that's the aha of the moment. And I think there's probably, again, we've talked about this before, going to that place is probably mostly curiosity rather than risk. But bringing it back and showing people is the risky bit. And so, and whilst, his definition or her definition of art is stuff that you instantly recognize, you also got the opportunity of people instantly rejecting it, instantly ridiculing it, or instantly ignoring it.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't even notice that you did a new painting,
That reminds you of something really good. I mean, the truth is, anything creative, anything that hasn't been seen by the world before, is likely to be rejected. In that we're, as people, we're drawn to things we're familiar with. And so if you see the world in a different way, if you've got some kind of new concept, then people are going to say, initially anyway, no, that's wrong. Why can't you do a good picture? Why can't you paint a nice one? Or I'll show you one that's a bit better than, all of those kind of things. And I suppose it's part and parcel. I think you're right, by the way. The curiosity helps you to see things in different ways, but the sharing with the world is the risk, and it's the bit where you're likely to get rejection. In fact, you could argue if you're not getting rejected, then you're doing something that's so familiar and safe, it's probably not worth sharing.
Yeah, possibly. Although, again, it comes down to this thing about, what context we put art or something created in the world. And my most recent favorite book is Fear and Art. And the two guys that wrote that, who have declined to come on the show, David Bales and Ted Orland, is because I didn't realize this book was written 30 years ago, and they've sort of become, they're sort of recluses now, and that's fine. But they had this little thing in the book. And I wanted to talk about how I came to be aware of this book, which I think is a really interesting thing. But he, in the book, he talks about that, we get worried about, we've got to fit into a certain school of thought, so we do that, we've got to fit into those rules. And he says it doesn't really matter, you shouldn't get head up about whether you're doing existentialism or impressionism, expressionism, or whateverism. And I love that whateverism, because I am definitely from the movement of whateverism. Or it's probably even more defined as whateverism and howeverism, or whatever and howeverism, because I don't paint the same thing and put it out there. I do some things, and I haven't gone back to my old fat man dancing. So when you do that, it's a double-edged sword. You've almost got, every child gets a prize because there's something for everyone in there. But on the other side of it, that if you've got something, if you see some artists who've got a particular style, and they can pre-sell them almost without even people seeing them. Because, if Rothko was still alive and as famous as he is now, you'd buy a Rothko if you had the money, sight unseen. It might be a bloody good investment.
Yes.
Even if you didn't like it, but you certainly wouldn't ignore it. So I think it's, again, it's this thing about, do you do something that is safe, but it might be commercially more successful, or do you put yourself out there? And I suppose it comes down to where you are in your life. But having said that, we go back to Van Gogh. Van Gogh didn't play it safe. He could have painted in the style of the day, and he just had a vision, and he kept on going, and he died a pauper.
Yes. I think the word is in my mind is story. Is kind of the question it raises is what's the story? And you mentioned Rothko. If any listeners don't know his work, if you first look at a Rothko, usually it's either pretty much one color or a few blocks of color, and there's not much to look at. And so you might initially go, well, I could do that, and I think what when you learn about the story, that these images are designed to connect very deeply with raw emotion. So it's the absence of anything else in them, I think, which is as powerful as anything. And the way they kind of are designed to, it's the freedom to get away from things that represent, flowers or buildings, whatever it might be, just raw emotion on a canvas. And suddenly they come to life. You say, oh, this is what this artist is trying to communicate. Now I understand why the works are all very big, or actually when you look deeply, there's not just one color, there's lots of colors in them and they change very slightly and so on. So I think the risk that artists take is mitigated when the story emerges. And maybe with Van Gogh, the story of light and the story of his life emerges, and the struggles that he himself was facing. Suddenly, this art tells a story, and now I can connect with it. I guess the question that raises for all of us is the extent to which you want to make your story overt. You say, this is why this painting is painted this way. Or the extent to which it's up to you to learn about it and to discover it. My work is my work, and you can decide if there's a story behind it or not.
The thing about this story, what I found is that, I've sold art to more people that I know. And I know that even myself, when I, buy art, there's something about it. If you know the artist, if you've met the artist, and you heard their story. So it's interesting because, if you want to be more successful and do work that isn't predictable, that's new, you're better off putting it out there and being with it, rather than doing it anonymously, because you basically you're more likely of being successful with.
It's a really good point that so if I agree with you, I've sold more of my work to people I know than people I don't know, and so they have a story that goes with the work, which is, I know the person that created this. I'm thinking out loud now about an exhibition going on at Sydney, called Incognito. I don't know if you've come across it, where artists submit work. I'm trying to remember if it costs you money or if it's free, and it's a particular size. It's the size of a large postcard. Thousands of works go into this show, and they're all for sale for exactly the same price.
Oh my gosh, yeah, they just had one up in Brisbane recently. So,
the twist is that as a buyer, you don't know which artist is which, and you might buy a work by a very famous, very successful artist for $100, or you might buy one by somebody completely unknown, incognito, for $100. The prices are always $100, and I think that the challenge to the buyer is to respond to a work as a work without any story behind it, because you don't know who painted it, and you don't know whether that artist is a successful artist or not. You just have to respond to, do I like this or not? Or whatever your own personal criteria might be.
Yeah. I did see a TikTok or Instagram for some people up here who go along and, except that, some artists, and this is back to the thing, who paint in a particular style, them. So these people camped out to get in first.
Oh, they knew they were going to find one thing.
Race around, they went, that one, that one, that one, that one. And they got these famous artists because they knew they could tell who the artist was. So I think that is sort of interesting. The interesting thing to do is to do it in the style of someone else without passing it off.
So you and I should paint like Van Gogh and put it into Incognito. Honestly.
No, I'm thinking someone who's
alive, maybe.
I just you talked about story there, Chris, and I just wanted to share the story how I came about this book, Art and Fear, which is 30 years old, which I didn't realize.
Yes.
About a month ago, I had an email from someone who wanted to market my book, and they're based in Canada. Funny, this came about because Stacey Paul, who lives in Canada, and they said, all these very complimentary things about the book. And that she was passionate about this, and she was doing a mission about people connecting, putting books in the world about people connecting with creativity. And she compared it to, she said, it sits along The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, which is one of my all-time favorite books, and Art and Fear by David Bales and Ted Orland. And so I went, wow. Well, I love the other two. I better get it. So I got the book and I loved it, Art and Fear. The sad part of the story is that when I went onto this person's website just to check her out to see whether I wanted to pursue it, because I get a lot of people wanting to market my book. On her contact page, it says, if you have received a cold email from me, it's not from me. It's probably very complimentary and accurate, but it's AI generated and it's a scam. And I wrote back to her and said, really? And when I looked at it, I did see that, some of the things, maybe I found it so complimentary, was that, some of the words had been recycled from my, no risk in reaching out, cold calling if you're scamming and pretending to be someone else. So, why they would go to that, but quite how they're going to work it, get the payment.
So work out where's the money in that? Where's the angle in this scam?
Say, pay me this amount of money, we'll publish your book, and it's not even the right person. It's a total scam. So it was really quite that was quite interesting. Chris, I think at the risk of pulling this short, but we are up to our allotted time.
We are, yes.
So I think I think this is a long time overdue, a discussion about risk in creativity on the Common Creative Podcast.
I agree completely. I've learned a lot. My two big outtakes from our conversation, which I've really enjoyed, is firstly, risk is a core part of creativity. We have to accept that it's part and parcel of being creative, and you can't get away from that. But secondly, and it was kind of a bit of a revelation towards the end of our chat, that maybe stories mitigate that risk. If there's a story to go with your work that explains why it might look or sound a particular way. Those are my two outtakes. How about you, Paul?
Oh, look, I have so many. I'm just, what I'm thinking is, what other holes do we have in 200 odd episodes, Chris? What else haven't we talked about?
Well, I'd love at some point to revisit the world of AI and its impact on creativity. We had a whole season on AI 2 or 3 years ago, and I'd love to have parked it there because I think AI has so many risks associated with it. The trouble is AI has moved so far in those few years, and I think we need to go back and check in and say, what does it now mean for creativity? I have a personal theory about the way it risks vegetating our brains because we're subcontracting creativity to computers. That's, I think, a hole in our armory.
Yeah. And look, I think, what I took away from it is this, that from one level about taking a risk, if you're a struggling artist and you've got to take a risk, then, it's maybe harder to take a risk if you do something that sells and people like. But I think that even, very successful artists, they push the boundaries and, they take risks to put like a new album out that's totally different, that people may, I was thinking about, can't think who, but, people that, like Paul McCartney did some stuff. They took a risk. Now, obviously, he wasn't short of a buck. He didn't really, need to get out there. And he could have just, started almost a Beatles tribute brand.
Yes.
Be very successful going around the world singing Beatles songs. But he took a risk, and I think he took a hit. And there's a lot of artists who take a hit, but, they put themselves out there. And that is that thing about fear, but getting over the fear, but about taking a risk. Yeah. And I think when it comes down to it, money or financial reward is only one part of that in return, whether you get paid or not. But there's obviously greater risks to the creative psyche, to our creative soul, when we're ignored, rejected, or ridiculed. That's what we risk. I think it's not so much, partly our reputation, but it's really we risk our confidence.
I don't know if it's a book, a t-shirt, or a song called Ignored, Rejected, and Ridiculed. But to me, that's the kind of flip side of creativity, and we all have to get to grips with being ignored, rejected, and ridiculed. Paul, thank you so much. If you've been listening to this show, thank you for joining us. Please put a comment. Let us know what you think of the conversation. We normally ask for a rating, ideally a high rating, for our guests. Imagine we've got a third imaginary guest who was brilliant, so if you could rate that guest. But also tell your mates about the Common Creative Podcast. Spread the word. We're keen to get the word out there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.
See you next week.